We, the members of Anand, would like to present India's ranking per 2017 World Happiness Report. We would like to discuss the steps that we can take towards a happier India. Our agenda for this presentation will cover four key aspects. Firstly, the measures of happiness per 2017 World Happiness Report. Secondly, understand the drivers behind India's ranking. Thirdly, suggest policies on how India can improve its position per the World Happiness Report. And lastly, what actions need to be taken to transform these policies into action. So, where does India rank per 2017 World Happiness Report? India ranks 122 out of 155 countries. Wow, India is second? Well, India is second lowest when compared to Asian counterparts. Let's look at this in a little more detail. On comparing with the various parameters basis which the World Happiness Report is prepared, India is pretty low in terms of social support. Also, the second most important aspect that India needs to focus on is health life expectancy. China, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka seem to be doing better on this parameter. So let's look at the issue on hand a little more in detail by taking the example of a farmer, Ramu. Ramu solely depends on farming for his living. However, unfortunately, he didn't have a great season last year and is really worried on how he should plan his year forward. He gets a call from one of his friends in Delhi, and his friend suggests him to come over as he can earn a better living and have a healthier life. Ramu is excited and takes the very next train to Delhi. Ramu moves to Delhi. Ramu is amazed by the city life. He gets a job. He then calls his family, his wife and son, to come over to Delhi to stay with him for the rest of their life. Hhowever, after 2 months, Ramu loses his job. He gets fired. Therefore, Ramu is now unemployed. His health is deteriorating. His child forgoes his primary education and starts working. Eventually, the entire family is under distress. So, what do you think really went wrong with Ramu and his family? Is it because of the detachment from social circle after he moved to the city? Is it because of the inappropriate action taken by Ramu's employer? Is it because of child labor that Ramu's son was forced into? Or is it because of Ramu's limited health coverage? Is this the story of just Ramu or several other people in India? Let's look at this in greater detail by considering the factors, by understanding the drivers behind this.
So the key question at this point is, along what dimensions can we improve India's happiness? We think that this has three facets to it. The first is giving people more freedom, right? It's about giving them substantive freedom and not just constitutionally guaranteed freedom, which means that they should be free from judgment or persecution when they make their choices or express their opinions in public. It's also about giving them resources to access choices, resources such as education, money, and opportunities. The second key facet is improving the public health infrastructure and the access to it. This is broadly divided into three specific key areas. The first is awareness about their current health status. A lot of people in India go undiagnosed with diseases, so improving early recognition of diseases, early treatment, vaccination, establishing community sanitation standards and protocols would go a long way in terms of improving India's healthcare. A crude measure of healthcare is life expectancy, in terms of how effective our policies are, in terms of making people live longer. Health coverage talks about doctor availability, it talks about healthcare infrastructure in remote areas, emergency wards being established for quick access in emergency situations, and giving people access to health insurance. The third facet is improving the basis of social support amongst our communities. This again involves a social basis for equality, which is mutual respect for our differing identities. It also involves things like employment security, which contributes towards financial stability for a lot of people. Trust in governance means that people can interact with their government, criticize them, and hold them accountable. Voluntary support was one of the key factors highlighted by the World Happiness Report 2017, which talks about communities where there is a greater degree of community engagement through charity or volunteerism generally tend to be happier than communities where this is lacking. Improvement on a few select factors can impact performance on a lot of broader parameters. What we mean by this is that these highlighted areas are not mutually exclusive and there are spillover effects. For instance, greater fabric for social equality and greater trust in governance can make people feel more comfortable expressing their views, enhancing thereby their freedom to express their voice or freedom of speech. We've decided to focus on two key areas in our presentation. The first is, how do we get people to live longer? How do we improve health coverage and life expectancy? And secondly, how do we instill trust and reduce inequality perceptions in our country? Let us now look at a few suggested policy changes to India's public health policy. The first would be to inculcate more private and public partnerships in the healthcare sector. We should do this because we cannot rely on purely public infrastructure in a country which is the size of India's, and the private sector is better at innovation and technology adoption. The trade-off here would be that this might not come across as a win-win strategy to private partners, and to mitigate the costs to them, we have to offer incentives to them. These could be subsidization of land permits or a more pro-business regulatory framework. The benefits, of course, would be cheaper access or better bang for the buck in terms of our public health expenditure, cost reduction, and much greater efficiency in terms of the delivery of services. The second policy is increasing healthcare expenditure from 1% to 3% of GDP in a phased manner, let's say by 2025. There are three reasons why we want to do this. First, to give a universal healthcare coverage scheme in terms of insurance. Second, to lead widespread immunization drives targeted at removing diseases which affect children the most. And thirdly, access to cheaper medicines for a population that is in dire need of them. The trade-off here is budget constraints on other activities as a result of increased expenditure on healthcare, and the need to employ a high number of skilled individuals in terms of healthcare planning and how this budget ought to be allocated. We think that the benefits, however, will be more long run in terms of a healthier citizenry being far more productive citizens in a country, and we think that this would pay off dividends in the future for India. Let us now look at a few policies for improving the basis of social support and welfare in our country. The first is to mandate job contracts and notice periods for all forms of employment. Lack of job security is one of the single biggest reasons for chronic anxiety and stress in the workplace, and job contracts and notice period can formalize employment and give employees a greater sense of satisfaction or stability in their lives. The trade-off here would be decrease in contractual jobs and possible increases in prices as companies pass on these costs to end consumers. However, we think that in the long run, the improvement in job standards would lead to greater productivity in the workforce, which is a good thing for the country going forward. The second would be to increase volunteerism or community engagement in both schools and workplace. While this reduces the number of hours that students or workers spend in their schools or workplace respectively, we think that the improvement in their ethical standards, a greater sense of engagedness and connectedness with the community, and a greater sense of drive and purpose which this gives would be a positive impact on these people. Thirdly, we think that private school educational vouchers should be given to students from financially deprived segments instead of forcing them to public schools. The private sector can provide the same quality of education at half the cost of what the government can do. They are much more efficient in terms of delivery of services. While this might lead to a few loss of revenues initially in existing private schools because of the subsidization, we think that the access to quality education for children across all financial segments is the single biggest equalizer in a country like India.
Finally, we propose the following four-phase approach to transform these policies into action. The first phase would be to define the governing roles. Here, we need to take a call between which policy will be enforced by the center and the state. Second, we need to identify people who will be accountable for the process throughout. And then we need to set up an escalation process to address anything that goes wrong in the execution. Second, we will identify the key functions for these stakeholders. These stakeholders would formulate goals and milestones for the entire spectrum of policies, and then they will also assign quarterly objectives that will help track the progression of these policies. Third, we will establish processes to drive adoption of these policies at the ground level. The idea here is to execute these improvements in select pilot zones and then conduct a nationwide rollout. Finally, we will measure effectiveness of our policies through state-level surveys. These will help us diagnose the perceptions categorically, and then some of these metrics could even be used to incentivize the executioners.